Equifax and other agencies similar to Equifax are effectively turning a private profit through providing a public good. And it's shocking the sheer number of Canadians and Americans that have been had their data compromised. And so just a clarification question at the outset. You say 19,000 Canadians. Is that only Canadians living in the United States?
No, that's Canadians resident in Canada.
Okay, and do you have numbers for Canadians living in the United States?
I don't have those numbers at this time.
Shouldn't you have those numbers?
I'd be happy to provide them to you in writing.
It's interesting, just in preparation for today, one would think you would have provided those numbers, but it would be great for you to provide those numbers in writing. You provided a timeline for us, but as you well know, and I know because I attended the Equifax hearing before Congress, the timeline is extraordinarily incomplete. So you don't mention at all what occurred in March, and perhaps you could tell this committee and the Canadian public, explain that the Department of Homeland Security did provide a warning in March and provide some information about the steps that Equifax US took to respond to that warning, and whether you think those steps were sufficient.
Sure. The timeline in the U.S. Began on March 9th. Equifax disseminated the U.S. CERT notification you mentioned internally by email, requesting that applicable personnel responsible for an Apache Struts installation upgrade their software. Consistent with our patching policy, the Equifax Security Department required that patching occur within a 48-hour period of time.
What was the follow-up with DHS? So DHS warns you in March, on March 9th or March 8th, and I understand that there was an internal request that the software be upgraded, that the patch be run, and the Security Department ran scans that did not find the same vulnerability that DHS found. So what was the follow-up with DHS?
On March 15th, our Security Department also ran scans, as you mentioned, that should have identified the systems that were vulnerable to the Apache Struts.
Yeah, so subsequent to that, what was the follow-up with DHS? Because it seems to me, you know, a security agency, perhaps one of the most important security agencies, says to Equifax, you have a vulnerability that could affect millions of Americans, and your security officials run a program and don't find anything. Is there any communication after that with DHS to say, we ran this and there are no problems? What did you find that we didn't find?
Yeah, I'm in my capacity as Chief Privacy Officer of Canada, so I wouldn't be privy to those discussions or any discussions that were had in that relation to those discussions.
Perhaps you could request that information and follow up in writing to this committee as to what was any follow-up communication with DHS from Equifax's point of view. I mean, it occurs to me if DHS came to my company and said you have a massive data vulnerability and I ran my own search and didn't find anything, I would certainly want to be communicating with DHS to let them know I didn't find anything and to ensure that they have followed up on that. So May 13th isn't in your notes as well, but May 13th, as I understand it, is when the hackers first accessed the information. And so it was between May 13th and the end of July that the hackers had access to the Equifax system. Is that right?
Correct, between May 13th and July 30th.
And we just finished a study on protecting Canadians' personal information, or we're in the midst of finishing and making recommendations. And a number of witnesses came before us and testified to the importance of encryption. It is astounding to me that millions of over 145,000 or 145 million Americans and then 19,000 Canadians had their information compromised, and it was that easy to go into a system and the information wasn't encrypted. Perhaps you could explain why there weren't sufficient encryption practices.
The standards we had in place in the U.S. were best-in-class standards in terms of they were recognized industry practice. It wasn't like the industry practice was not followed. In this case, as a result of human error and IT error, the vulnerability occurred and the hackers got in.
Perhaps I expect you don't have an answer today, but perhaps you could follow up in writing as well. On a going forward basis to ensure that something like this never happens again, and that was the third point you made before us, and I appreciate that, you could explain to this committee what steps you are taking to strengthen your encryption practices.
Sure. In Canada, our information is encrypted and tokenized. We're PCI compliant, and we follow the security standards, but just going back in terms of the vulnerabilities that occurred, we're having closed loop confirmation. So that's in basic terms that we're not only issuing the order to patch, but now we're also receiving confirmation, so closing that loop that it has been patched.
Right. Okay, so it's great to see that you've got some measures, including providing for the next 12 months up to $50,000 in insurance for identity theft. There's no guarantee that identity theft happens over that period of 12 months, and Equifax has quite clearly been negligent in this case with people's data. And so I wonder, are you committed to ensuring that all Canadians are made whole as a result of any identity theft that is a consequence of Equifax's negligence?
So for the impacted 19,000 or so, we're offering Premier, which is a product, our Premier Credit Monitoring, which is a product that's been used in other breaches, major breaches in Canada, Home Depot being one of them. And that's offered free 12 months for all consumers impacted. For other consumers who are worried or afraid, they can put an alert on their file, come to Equifax. We're offering it free of charge.
12 months.
For 6 years.
For 6 years, okay. And so that $50,000, up to $50,000 insurance is available for 6 years?
That's for people subscribing to the credit monitoring product, which we're offering to the impacted Canadians. All other Canadians can...
No, that's why I'm talking about the impacted Canadians, those who are susceptible to damages as a result of Equifax's negligence. I want to make sure that those Canadians are made whole without having to start a class action or starting individual small claim suits. That's what I want to make sure. And so I hope today you are able to confirm to this committee that Equifax is guaranteeing that those Canadians will be made whole.
Yes, for the 19,000 impacted by this incident, they are made whole in terms of the Premier product that we're offering them that offers them up to $50,000 in identity theft insurance.
And that's over a 12-month or a 6-year period? 12-month
period.
So what happens after that 12 months? How are they made whole if identity theft happens after that 12 months?
So in terms of the products they're offering, they can continue their subscription to credit monitoring after that.
To pay for it?
It's a paid service here in Canada.
So it sounds like you're not actually guaranteeing that they'll be made whole if identity theft happens after 12 months.
The product offers 12 months of credit monitoring, and it offers other indicators like lost wallet. If there's information from your wallet that's stolen or lost, we'll monitor that. We'll also give them alerts. Anytime anybody accesses their credit file, they'll be alerted to that fact within that 12-month period. So the 12-month clock starts ticking when they subscribe to the product. So it's not as of the date of the breach or their letter, it's when they subscribe to the product.
Now I see that on your website that you're selling consumers their own information that you are collecting, that your business customers are paying you for, and you're selling it back to customers, the verification of that information, for $20 a month. Could you please explain the business model behind this?
Sure. First, in regards to any inaccuracies or information that's lacking on the file, we welcome questions from consumers across Canada. We welcome, and Tony can speak to our consumer call centers. We want to make sure that information is fair and accurate. That's what our legislation says. That's how we operate our business. It has to be.
In fact, it's because you're selling that information. It has to be accurate. That's your business model. It's up to you to make sure that the information is accurate, not the consumer. If there is suspicious activity on the consumer's account, you should be paying for that investigation. If the consumer wants to know what their credit score is, yes, they should have access to that immediately for free, and that's what the court judgment in Canada said. The consumers had that access, but restoration specialists to help you recover from ID theft, the consumer has to pay for that. You should be paying for that if somebody is able to steal their ID. $19.95 per month. So I'd like to know what costing went in to discover that was actually the cost of providing this service to customers. Cancel at any time, but sorry, no partial month refunds.
So if you're one of the 19,000 impacted, we are paying for that service. We're affording all Canadians, and we've seen, over close to 2,000 Canadians so far subscribe to that service that we've offered for free to them.
For 12 months, am I correct?
For 12 months,
It should be for life, Mr. Russo, for life.
And
this consumers have their SIN numbers and their birth date for life. They are potentially at risk for life. I would leave that for you to think about.
And so there's a preliminary report released in relation to the internal investigation. There's a final report that's public?
In terms of the Mandiant report?
That's right.
It's a confidential report.
I see. So even though 145 million Americans and 19,000 Canadians have their data made more public. The investigation of that internally is not going to be made public. 12-month free subscription. How many people have opted in of the 19,000 Canadians?
So far, we have about 1,700 Canadians. Tony's got an updated number as of this morning.
Percent of Canadians affected have opted into the program so far.
There was the initial mailing, just to level set, the initial mailing was 8,000. Of those 8,000, over 1,600 people have subscribed to that. The second mailing in regards to 11,000 had gone out within the last few days. So we're seeing an uptick in terms of people starting to subscribe to that. So it was 22%.
You've undertaken to provide this committee numbers of Canadians affected in the United States as well. Will you also provide this committee with information about the number of Canadians in the United States affected who have opted into this program as well, this additional protection?
We'll make our best efforts to.
Thanks. Are there any reports of identity theft? Has there been any identity theft reported to Equifax, either in the States or in Canada?
To the best of my knowledge, not to my knowledge, Tony can speak from consumer relations, but
I only have information based on the Canadian consumers, and we have not had any complaints in regards to identity theft or fraudulent activity from the impacted Canadians that we identified.
So to follow up on a previous question of mine, March 8th or 9th, DHS notifies Equifax in the United States of a data vulnerability, and there's an internal audit run in some fashion by internal security officials. They find nothing. To your knowledge, you're going to get us information if there has been. There was no follow-up with DHS. Was there any follow-up from senior officials at Equifax or senior management as to their own security team to say, so you just did one sweep, didn't find anything, but DHS has said this was a problem, or was there just radio silence between March 15th and end of July?
our former CEO, Rick Smith, was told about the suspicious activity on July 31st.
Right, but if you're in a senior management position, DHS has said to you, this is a problem, you're going to get us information as to whether you follow up with DHS, but was there any internal follow-up after that March 15th sweep, or that was sufficient to satisfy concerns of senior management?
I'm in my capacity as Canadian CPO. I wouldn't have that knowledge. I wouldn't be privy to that information. Sorry.
Okay, so it occurs to me, DHS notifies Equifax of security vulnerability. There's one sweep done, and then I should also add, I've got information here that says Equifax did not take advantage of DHS's automated indicator sharing program that would enable the exchange of cyber threat indicators between the private sector and the government. An Apache Strut patch was not adequately installed as it ought to have been. Is that fair to say? You add up all these factors. Would you characterize that as negligence on behalf of your parent company?
I would not characterize that as negligence.
Okay, well, allow me to characterize it as negligence. And yeah, that negligence, and where there are damages that might flow to Canadian consumers, ought not Equifax to make these Canadians whole and to ensure that no Canadian experiences any damages, any loss at their own expense as a result of the negligence of Equifax?
And we're taking steps to ensure that we're monitoring the dark web, that this information is not being traded, not being compromised. We're offering the premier product to ensure Canadians have protections in place. We have the call center available to answer any questions or concerns that Canadians may have. We're taking all the best steps and practices and working in tandem with the OPC and their guidance to make sure that we're doing the best thing for each individual Canadian consumer.
Can you provide this committee with the, in writing, I expect you don't have it today, but the detailed steps Equifax is taking to monitor the dark web, simply because I'm not entirely sure what that means. So you mentioned Home Depot as an example, and in response to Mr. Bayless's questions, you said that the 12-month offer of additional services is sort of a standard in relation to these breaches, and you pointed to Home Depot. You may also be aware, though, of course, that Home Depot settled a class action suit against them in relation to that privacy breach, and so you fully expect, I would assume, to have set aside some funds for a class action suit and to make sure Canadians are made whole through that process?
We manage the litigation process with our litigation counsel.
I ask only because you had said Home Depot is a good example. Home Depot paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to Canadian consumers as a result of that data breach, and there was no there had been no identity theft there either. And my last question, so this committee is considering recommending giving the Privacy Commissioner new powers, including the power to levy fines where companies have failed to protect privacy adequately. What do you think about that potential recommendation?
Actually, we've worked with the former Industry Canada and with Canadian Marketing Association and other associations in regards to those regs and guidance. And we've worked with the OPC in terms of better protecting consumers, giving consumers control of their information.
That ability to levy fines. So we're considering new powers for the Privacy Commissioner. The UK Commissioner, Privacy Commissioner, as an example, has the ability to levy fines and has done so, as an example, in a case against Sony. So in this case, Equifax having not acted appropriately and adequately, I would say, in protecting Canadians' privacy, there would be the potential, presumably, if the OPC had such powers to levy fines. Would you support the OPC having such ability or such powers to levy fines?
We're open to working with government on all new guidance and all new regulations.
All right. Thanks very much.